Pillars of Eternity 2, like any CRPG, has very specific mechanics when it comes to combat and building a character, and understanding how these mechanics interact can be very useful in planning out your playthrough and dealing with the opponents the game throws at you. So with that in mind, here's a basics guide for all the combat mechanics you need to know in order to navigate your way unscathed across the harder difficulties. Pillars of Eternity 2 has a real-time plus pause combat system, meaning that unless you specifically pause the game, every action will occur in real time. The biggest limitation to this real-time combat for your characters and enemies comes down to their action speed, so let's start there. Action speed is a combination of a character's reload, recovery, cast, and attack time. Reload time is the time required to reload a firearm or crossbow. Recover time is the downtime between any action that isn't a firearm or crossbow. Cast time is the time required to successfully cast a spell, and attack time is the time required to successfully perform an attack action with a weapon or attack ability. So if you swap weapons during this attack time, you won't deal damage. With that in mind, action speed is easily one of the biggest statistics to keep an eye out for, and generally anything that incurs a big recovery penalty is something to avoid or carefully consider at the very least. Dexterity is the only attribute that increases or decreases action speed and should virtually always be kept at a base of 10 or maxed entirely because it has such a large impact. Exceptions to this rule would be a passive, heavy tank character whose main role is standing in the way of enemies, as movement and engagement, more on that in a moment, is unaffected by action speed. In that case, you could clad a character in the heaviest of armor, and if you don't care about his or her actual damage output, then feel free to minimize action speed, as their main role would be that of a wall between your faster characters and your enemies. Another exception would be a support chanter, whose main support abilities come from passive AoE chants that are also unaffected by action speed. Similarly, in that case you could build this character to merely stand in the middle of your group, passively buffing them, all the while caring little about how fast he or she performs other abilities. Besides this, the only things unaffected during combat by action speed are things such as changing a combat fighter stance, paladin aura, or weapon modal ability. So as a general rule of thumb is that if you want your character to do a lot of weapon attacks, you will want to maximize action speed as much as possible. Similarly, if you want them to cast a lot of spells, you'll want to keep this high as well. This brings me to armor, as armor is one of the biggest decreases in action speed possible and affects anything except cast and attack time. As such, the heavy armor should really only be worn by a character that can take a tank roll upon themselves. If you are making a damage-dealing oriented fighter, for instance, equipping lighter armor is easily the biggest boost in damage you could go with. Now keep in mind that in Pillars of Eternity 2 you have diminishing returns in the mathematical formula for action speed, meaning that you will never be able to reach zero recovery, and ultimately stacking too many forms of action speed will be far less efficient. If you are dual wielding, for instance, you get an instant 30% action speed increase for weapon attacks, which is fantastic, and dual wielding as such is a really strong baseline upgrade, but further getting the 2 weapon style trait in talents might not be worth it, since this only increases action speed by another 15%, but as a result of diminishing returns, if you are already on high dexterity and low armor, chances are it will in fact do very little, so be wary of this. Similarly, mathematically, negative effects, such as from wearing heavy armor, have a much bigger impact than positive effects, which once more brings me back to avoiding recovery penalty weapon modals as much as possible. In short, if your character isn't a tank, give him or her light armor and avoid recovery penalty modals. Now, once you actually get into combat and you try to hit an enemy, you'll see a number of different icons above their health bar, the first of which is their respective chance to hit defense. Every attack in Pillars of Eternity, spell, ability, or weapon attack compares your accuracy versus one of their 4 different defenses, which calculates whether the attack is a hit, miss, graze, or crit. The first defense is Deflect, and Deflect can be remembered as single target attacks and abilities. Almost every single direct melee or ranged attack will target Deflect. The second is Fortitude, and this one is far more specific and generally targeted by spells that inflict disease, poison, or try to knock someone prone, for instance. The third is Reflex, and this is essentially the opposite of Deflect. Reflex is the defense against the vast majority of area of effect damage spells and abilities. And finally, the fourth defense is Will, and Will is targeted by spells that mess with your character's mind or perception. Knowing what type of defense enemies target is therefore quite important, with most basic units generally targeting Deflect. Likewise, it's important that you properly build your spell or weapon combinations after those types of defenses. Nature's Mark, for instance, decreases an enemy's deflect and reflex scores by 10, meaning that if you follow this up with a will targeting spell after, you are essentially wasting Nature's Mark. The first red icon then represents the chance to hit depending on your accuracy versus their specific defense. Every attack is rolled between 1 and 100. Your accuracy is then reduced by their particular defense, and that number is added to your attack roll. If an attack can graze, between 25 and 50 will be a graze, which comes down to 50% effectiveness on damage and effects. Anything between 51 and 100 will be a hit, which is regular effectiveness, and above 100 will be a critical hit, which is 125% effectiveness, and also increases the penetration of the attack by 50%, which brings me to the second yellow icon. This icon shows how much higher your penetration is compared to their armor rating. Every attack that is a graze or better and deals damage has your penetration rolled against their armor rating. If your penetration equals their armor rating, you'll do 100% damage. If your penetration is double their armor rating, you'll do 130% damage, and anything between equal or double will still be 100%, and you can't go over 130% damage from penetration. If, however, your penetration is below their armor rating, you will do 25% less damage for every point of armor rating they have above it, meaning that, ultimately, penetration is very important for dealing damage. And conversely, armor rating is very important for you to stay alive. Now, armor itself comes in different shapes and sizes. If you look at a character sheet, you'll see a baseline armor rating which is calculated against everything except the specific armor rating values mentioned below it. This character, for instance, has an armor rating of 8 against everything except crushing damage and freezing damage, which are both at a mere 6. Weapons can have multiple types of damage, pierce, crush, or slash, and are as such an important thing to keep in mind when building a character as well. More on this in my specific character creation guide. Moving on to another big combat element, buffs and debuffs, or as Pillars of Eternity 2 refers to them, afflictions and inspirations. If you went through character creation, you've seen this come up a lot with the various races, as quite a few have so-called resistances against certain afflictions, which are all linked to the various attribute. Dexterity afflictions, for instance, start at tier 1 with hobbled, which reduces your dexterity and stride being combat movement speed. At tier 2 it becomes immobilized, which reduces your dexterity and prevents movement entirely, and at the maximum tier, tier 3, it's called paralyzed, which reduces your dexterity, prevents them from taking any action, and converts 50% of hits into crits done against them. Quite nasty. In order to avoid these, you can have resistances. A resistance will downgrade an affliction to its previous tier. Tier 1 is removed, tier 2 is reduced to tier 1, and tier 3 is reduced to tier 2. If you have a Wood Elf, which inherently have resistances to dexterity afflictions, and cast a Paralyze effect at tier 3 dexterity affliction, it will instead be reduced to Immobilized, the tier 2 dexterity affliction. Resistances are also not expended, meaning that a resistance will make a tier 3 affliction completely impossible against that character. Note, resistances of the same type don't stack, so more than one of each is actually pointless. Similarly, an inspiration, a buff, of the same type as the affliction will remove that affliction entirely, and an affliction will remove an inspiration. They cancel each other out. So a debuff that causes a constitution effect will be removed by, say, Frenzy, which grants a might and a constitution inspiration, leaving the character with the might inspiration. Also note that buffs, inspirations, do not stack. If you have 2 might inspirations, the highest one will be active at any given time. For instance, Frenzy from Barbarians can be activated at the same time as Swift Strikes from Monks, and both give action speed, but as they don't stack, only the highest will affect your character while that duration is present, which is Frenzy. Now, Swift Strikes also gives the Quick Inspiration, which is a separate effect, meaning that activating both gives you the effects of Frenzy in addition to the effects of Quick, but not both of the action speed effects. Another way to avoid afflictions from hitting you is, of course, preventing them from ever happening, and this is where interrupts get into play. In Pillars of Eternity 2, specific abilities or attacks have a chance to interrupt, which is indicated in their description, and can vary from interrupt on graze, meaning as long as they roll a graze, or interrupt on crit, requiring them to crit to interrupt. Interrupts cancel whatever an enemy is doing at that time unless they have a so-called level of concentration, in which case it cancels that concentration. Engagements are another important thing to keep an eye out for. In Pillars of Eternity 2, far fewer enemies will have engagement than in 1, as it now works with an engagement slot system that starts at 0 for everyone. This limit can be increased through weapons such as spears, which have a particular modal that gives them +1 engagement, all shields give +1 engagement baseline, or certain talons and subclasses increase engagement as well. For enemies it's more touch and go, but if they have a shield they will most likely have engagement, and you can bet that any boss will have 1 or 2 slots at the very least. When you or an enemy moves out of an engagement zone, indicated by a red line from enemies and green for yours, you will incur a disengagement attack, which is a free attack that costs no action speed and will do significantly increased damage with a higher chance to hit. This can be avoided by using abilities that prone the enemy or incur a might affliction, in addition to certain movement skills. Power level is then another factor that enhances the effectiveness of your party and is something you'll have seen pop up during character creation as well. In essence, power level increases the damage and duration of spell effects but doesn't affect summons or weapon-based attacks, denoted by either a primary or full attack. Primary using only your main weapon, whereas full attacks use both in the case of dual wielding. As such, power level is especially important for casters and far less so for martial characters, with the one notable exception being monks, as their fist scaling is also based on power level. Notably, single-class characters gain power level faster than multi-class characters. Single-class will gain 1 power level every 2 levels until level 13, after which it takes 3 levels, whereas multi-class characters will always gain a power level every 3 levels, meaning they will be perpetually behind. In short, for every power level you'll have above the base level of the spell, you will get scaling bonuses. Abilities with multiple projectiles will get an additional one every second power level increase, damage goes up generally by 10% per power level, penetration goes up by 1/4 per power level, and duration is increased by 5% per power level. And finally, power level also brings me to Empower, which is granted upon reaching level 2, 6, 10, 14, and 18, and can be used once during combat and only refills by resting. Empower can be used in 2 different ways. First, it can be used to empower a specific ability by selecting the Empower charge, clicking on the ability, and then potentially targeting an enemy or ally if necessary. For regular spells, this grants a +10 power level for that ability, whereas for weapon-based attacks, it grants +20 accuracy and +5 penetration. Secondly, Empower can also be used to refill your resource pool by selecting the charge and clicking on your character's portrait, which will then restore half of your total resources. And with that, we've gone over most of the global combat mechanics in Pillars of Eternity 2, and if you have a good grasp over these particular mechanics and a solid build, nothing can stand in your way. Regarding solid builds, make sure to check out the character build guide where I go over all of the basics as well. Thank you for watching, my name is Spinhas, and I'll see you in the next video.